Picture this. The marble corridors of Pella gleam with oil lamps, their flickering light catching on bronze shields and embroidered robes. The air hums with lyre music and the low murmur of nobles gathered for a wedding meant to seal the fate of a kingdom. Yet behind the veil of ritual lies a current darker than the night outside. This is no ordinary union, it is a pact born of desperation and ambition, and at its heart stands a woman whose very survival depends on the choices she makes tonight. Arsinoe II, daughter of the great Ptolemy of Sota, adjusts the golden diadem atop her dark hair. It feels heavier than any crown she has ever worn, not because of its weight but because of the hand that placed it there. At 40 she has been a queen in multiple courts, a mother of 3 sons, and a player in the deadly game of dynastic survival. But tonight she marries her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus, the man the Macedonians call Kerounos, the thunderbolt, for his brutal speed in seizing power. His arm coils around her waist in a grip too tight, his smile too sharp, a predator's mask barely softened by ceremony. The priests chant invocations to Zeus and Hera, divine siblings whose sacred marriage provides a thin veil of legitimacy for this human echo. To the Greeks assembled, the irony is bitter. Zeus and Hera may be sung of by poets, but mortal sibling unions are whispered about with disgust. Yet to the Egyptians, whose gods Arsinoe once watched in childhood rituals, sibling marriage carried divine authority. Isis wed Osiris, and from their union came cosmic order. 2 cultures, 2 traditions, colliding on this marble floor. The nobles gathered pretend at joy. They lift their cups, they shout their toasts. But beneath the glittering surface lies unease. They know Ceraunus murdered Seleucus, one of Alexander's last surviving companions, to snatch Macedonia's throne. They know this marriage is less about love than about legitimacy. For Ceraunus, Arsinoe's bloodline connects him directly to Egypt's ruling dynasty, strengthening his fragile claim. For Arsinoe, the bargain is stark, her son's safety in exchange for her dignity. Her eyes, however, tell another story. Behind the calm mask of the queen, rage coils like a serpent. She has seen too many promises broken, too many oaths turned to ash. Her first marriage at 15 to Lysimachus, a man old enough to be her grandfather, taught her that queenship meant being bartered like a jewel. She bore him sons, watched them grow into the dangerous currency of succession disputes, and endured whispers of sorcery when she maneuvered to protect them. Now, in middle age, she finds herself once again a pawn in a man's game. Yet a pawn can become a queen if she survives the other side of the board. The wine tastes of ash in her mouth as the toasts resound. Ceraunus raises his cup with all the pomp of a conquering king, his words dripping with the promises of protection, of dynastic unity, of honoring her children as heirs. But Arsinoe knows those promises are as fragile as pottery shards. She sees it in his eyes, that hunger, the same hunger that drove him to seize Seleucus's throne. To him, her sons are obstacles, not heirs, and obstacles are meant to be removed. Her eldest son, Ptolemy, is absent tonight. He refused to come to Pella, sensing what his mother could not resist, the trap cloaked as a wedding. His absence may yet save him. But her younger boys, Lysimachus and Philip, sleep under this very roof, their fates tied to their mother's bargain. The ceremony concludes. The priests' chants fade into applause. The nobles erupt in celebration, relieved to see power stabilized, at least for now. Yet within the silence between the notes of music, Arsinoe feels the truth. This marriage is a shackle, and the man beside her does not see her as a partner but as a stepping stone to secure his throne. Tonight Macedonia celebrates, but tomorrow its palace corridors will whisper with blood. And Arsinoe? She will not wait meekly for fate's decree. She has survived courts more treacherous than this one, endured betrayal, exile, and loss. Now, even as she smiles for the watching nobles, she begins to weave the web that will determine whether she endures, or whether this marriage becomes the tomb of her dynasty. To understand Arsinoe II's choices in that fateful Macedonian palace, we must step back to the very beginning, to the world into which she was born. Around 316 BCE, the gleaming new city of Alexandria rose from the Egyptian coastline, its marble streets and lighthouse promising to be the jewel of the Mediterranean. This was no ordinary city. It was the creation of Alexander the Great's most trusted general, Ptolemy I Sota, her father. Ptolemy was no mere soldier. He had been one of Alexander's bodyguards, a man who helped carry the conqueror's corpse from Babylon and then carved out his own kingdom from the chaos of succession. For him, empire was both inheritance and invention. He declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt, adopting the trappings of the ancient kings while ruling as a Macedonian general. For his daughter Arsinoe, This duality would shape her entire existence. She was raised in the opulent palace of Alexandria, a world of Greek philosophy and Egyptian ritual, where bloodline was both privilege and prison. Her stepmother, Berenice I, offered a living lesson in the possibilities of ambition. Once a relatively obscure noblewoman, Berenice rose to queenship through intelligence, charm, and calculation. She whispered to Arsinoe stories of goddesses and heroines, teaching her that a woman could bend fortune if she possessed the will. Yet these tales were counterbalanced by harsher realities. Daughters of dynasties were currency. They were alliances made flesh, traded across borders in exchange for armies and treaties. Outside the palace walls, Alexandria was a city drunk on promise. Ships from Arabia and India crowded the harbour, their holds bursting with spices, ivory, and silks. Scholars poured into the great library, filling its scrolls with the knowledge of the known world. Philosophers debated beneath colonnades, while priests in ancient temples carried on rituals that had been performed for 3,000 years. For young Arsinoe, this was not an abstract world. She learned Greek from tutors in the palace, but Egyptian from the servants who raised her. She saw the sacred ceremonies where priests invoked the gods with chants older than her own dynasty. She listened as they told of Isis and Osiris, divine siblings whose sacred union upheld the cosmic order. Among Egyptians, sibling marriage was no scandal, it was sanctity. But in the Greek world to which her family still belonged, such unions were viewed with revulsion. Arsinoe grew up at the intersection of two worlds, whose values would forever remain in tension. By the time she turned 15, Arsinoe's childhood ended abruptly. The year was 300 BCE, and her father faced a crisis. The successors of Alexander, called the Diadochi, were still locked in a brutal struggle for supremacy. Alliances shifted like sand, and survival meant forging bonds with enemies before they became threats. Ptolemy needed an ally in Thrace, where the veteran king Lysimachus ruled a turbulent kingdom surrounded by rivals. The solution was as cold as it was common: marriage. Lysimachus was nearly 55 years old, his face weathered by decades of battle. He bore scars from campaigns that stretched from the Danube to India. Legends whispered that he once killed a lion with his bare hands, earning the loyalty of Alexander himself. To a 15-year-old girl, he must have seemed both terrifying and magnificent. Yet in the eyes of her father, he was not a husband but a fortress of flesh and steel. The wedding was staged in Sardis, a city once capital of the Persian Empire, now a jewel of Hellenistic politics. The great hall glittered with oil lamps, gold-leafed walls, and the perfume of exotic incense. Nobles and envoys from across the Greek world gathered, watching as Arsinoe, draped in Egyptian linen dyed purple and crowned with a diadem, stood at the altar beside a man 4 decades her senior. The poets likened her to Helen of Troy, to Penelope the faithful, their verses soaring with praise. Musicians filled the air with flutes and harps, while dancers twirled across marble floors. But beneath the gilded spectacle lay a bitter truth. This was no union of hearts. It was a treaty written in flesh and sealed with wine. Arsinoe drank from the ceremonial cup, her future already shifting into a role she had not chosen. Yet, even in that moment, observers noted her sharp eyes, her ability to mask fear behind composure. She may have been young, but she had already learned that survival was not granted by beauty or birthright alone. It required patience, intelligence, and the will to turn chains into weapons. Thus began her apprenticeship in the treacherous politics of the Hellenistic courts. For Arsinoe, marriage was not the end of innocence, it was the beginning of power, purchased at the highest price. When Arsinoe arrived in Thrace as the wife of King Lysimachus, she entered a court far harsher than the glittering halls of Alexandria. The Macedonian general had ruled for more than 2 decades, but his kingdom was surrounded by hungry rivals. To the north, the Thracian tribes, restless and brutal. To the east, the Seleucid Empire, sprawling from Anatolia to India, under the command of Seleucus I. To the south and west, other heirs of Alexander waiting for the moment to strike. The palace itself reflected this tension. Sardis was rich, but its grandeur was edged with steel. Soldiers thronged its corridors, mercenaries sharpened their blades in the courtyards, and whispers of rebellion floated through the banquet halls. Arsinoe, a teenager in a foreign land, had little protection beyond her beauty, her wit, and her ability to read the dangerous game unfolding around her. Her new husband was not without charm, but he was first and foremost a soldier. His body bore the scars of countless battles, and his gaze was that of a man who weighed everything: people, cities, even his new wife as assets to be used or discarded. Yet to Arsinoe, this was also an education. She watched as Lysimachus judged disputes, rewarded loyalty, and punished betrayal with a cold efficiency that terrified his enemies. From him, she learned that power was not maintained by love or trust, but by fear and calculation. Within a year, Arsinoe had her first child, a boy named Ptolemy, born in 299 BCE. Two more sons followed Lysimachus and Philip. With each birth, her status at court grew stronger. She was no longer merely a foreign queen but the mother of princes, each one a potential heir. Yet power in the Hellenistic courts was never simple. Lysimachus already had an older son, Agathocles, by a previous wife. To many nobles, Agathocles was the rightful heir, a seasoned commander beloved by soldiers. Arsinoe's children, though royal, were young and vulnerable. The whispers began slowly, then spread through the court like wildfire. The Egyptian queen sought to displace Agathocles, to make her sons kings of Thrace. Whether or not she truly plotted against him, perception was enough to stoke division. Factions formed, one backing the established heir, the other seeing opportunity in Arsinoe's bloodline and Ptolemaic gold. For Arsinoe, this was her trial by fire. She was still in her 20s, far from home, surrounded by nobles who despised her influence. Yet she adapted with astonishing speed. She cultivated allies among the court ladies, buying loyalty with gifts and favors. She patronized philosophers and poets, ensuring her name was whispered in intellectual circles with reverence. She attended religious ceremonies, honoring local gods while quietly maintaining her devotion to Egyptian rites. Every gesture, every word, was calculated. But no calculation could protect her from the inevitable confrontation. By 283 BCE, her eldest son Ptolemy was 16, old enough to be considered for succession. The question of who would rule after Lysimachus could no longer be avoided. The old king, now in his 70s, faced a choice that would decide not only his dynasty but Arsinoe's fate, Agathocles or the younger princes. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes of the age. Agathocles was suddenly accused of treason. The charges were flimsy, a handful of intercepted letters, rumors of secret meetings, but in the courts of the Diadochi, appearances were often enough to condemn. Some historians claim Arsinoe orchestrated the accusations, whispering poison into her husband's ear. Others suggest that Lysimachus himself, paranoid and wary of losing power, made the decision. Whatever the truth, the outcome was swift and brutal. Agathocles was executed, his death shattering the court. Nobles who had served Lysimachus for decades now muttered darkly that the queen had bewitched him, that she was a second Medea, a woman who destroyed her family for ambition. For Arsinoe, it was a victory that came with a terrible cost. Her sons were now undisputed heirs, but the kingdom itself fractured. Enemies outside Thrace sensed weakness. Seleucus, the last of Alexander's original generals, began to march west. The Thracian tribes pressed harder against the northern frontier. Pirates raided coastal cities unchecked. Lysimachus, old and weakened, struggled to hold the kingdom together. In 281 BCE, the crisis exploded into war. At the Battle of Corupedium, Lysimachus faced Seleucus in what would be the final duel of their generation. Both men were in their 70s, veterans of Alexander's campaigns, carrying the weight of empires on their shoulders. The clash was fierce, but Lysimachus's forces, already fractured by internal dissent, collapsed. The old king himself was cut down, his body pierced by spears. With his death, the kingdom of Thrace crumbled overnight. Arsinoe, now a widow at 35, stood in the wreckage. She had 3 young sons to protect, but no army, no allies strong enough to save them. The kingdom that had once seemed secure dissolved around her, its cities opening their gates to Seleucus, its nobles abandoning her cause. For most women, this would have been the end, a descent into exile, obscurity, or worse. But Arsinoe was no ordinary queen. Even as the walls of her world collapsed, she was already planning her next move. She gathered her children, secured what treasures she could, and prepared to flee into the night. The girl who had once been paraded as a bride was now a fugitive, riding under cover of darkness, the torches of enemy soldiers flickering on the horizon. She had survived court intrigue, the death of a stepson, the collapse of a kingdom. Now she faced the most perilous challenge of all: survival in a world where every path led into the jaws of betrayal. The death of Lysimachus shattered the fragile world Arsinoe had built. In the chaotic aftermath of Corupedium, the once gilded queen found herself stripped of power, wealth, and safety. Her palace at Sardis fell to Seleucus's soldiers, her allies scattered, and her children, 3 young princes barely past boyhood, were reduced from heirs to fugitives. For the first time in her life, Arsinoe was not merely maneuvering within a court. She was running for her life. Picture the scene: a royal caravan under cover of darkness. Torches flicker against the cold Anatolian night, their light swallowed by the vast emptiness of the landscape. Arsinoe rides at the center, her sons beside her, Ptolemy 17, Lysimachus 15, and Philip 12. Gone are the jeweled diadems and purple robes. They wear coarse wool cloaks, their horses burdened not with treasures but with provisions for flight. Behind them, Thrace burns. Seleucus claims the kingdom, and his soldiers hunt down all who might support Arsinoe's line. Every mile is a gamble, every village a potential trap. But fate, always capricious in the world of the Diadochi, intervened. As Arsinoe fled west, Seleucus himself was murdered not by an enemy general, but by a supposed ally. Ptolemy Ceraunus, Arsinoe's half-brother, struck down the old conqueror and claimed Macedonia for himself. Overnight, the fragile balance of power shifted again. Arsinoe, who had barely escaped annihilation, now faced a new, even darker reality. The man who ruled Macedonia was not only her father's son, but also one of the most ruthless figures in the Hellenistic world. Ceraunus was cunning, merciless, and ambitious. He had long been excluded from Egypt's throne, overshadowed by Arsinoe's branch of the dynasty. Now, with Seleucus dead, he grasped his chance to claim Alexander's homeland. To secure his fragile legitimacy, he reached out with an offer that chilled Arsinoe to her core: marriage. The proposal was wrapped in honeyed words. A messenger arrived, speaking of reconciliation, of unity between brother and sister, of destiny fulfilled. Ceraunus promised to acknowledge Arsinoe's sons as heirs, to restore her children to royal standing, to bind together their fractured family in a union that would strengthen the bloodline of Ptolemy Sota. But Arsinoe knew the language of power too well. Behind the promises lay the unmistakable stench of danger. Still, she had no choice. Widowhood and exile offered only obscurity or worse, annihilation. Her sons, the last hope of her line, needed protection. Macedonia, with its ancient prestige, offered a throne from which she might yet safeguard them. To refuse, Ceraunus was to condemn them to wandering poverty. To accept him was to walk willingly into the lion's den. And so, with her jaw set and her gaze unflinching, Arsinoe agreed. It was a decision born not of trust but of necessity, a gamble in which the stakes were nothing less than her children's lives. Before departing, she made one last, desperate calculation. She sent her eldest son Ptolemy away, to the safety of distant allies. If Ceraunus betrayed her, as she suspected he would at least one heir might survive. The marriage was staged with all the magnificence of Macedonian tradition. In Pella, the ancient capital where Alexander himself had once played as a boy, the nobles gathered to witness the union. Ceraunus stood tall and commanding, his smile sharp as a blade. Arsinoe, regal in her bearing but hollow-eyed from loss, donned the golden diadem once more. The priests invoked Zeus and Hera, as though divine sanction could cleanse the unease that weighed heavily in the chamber. To the Macedonians, the marriage was unsettling. The Egyptians might see sibling unions as sacred, a mirror of Isis and Osiris, but to the Greeks it reeked of desperation. Yet they applauded, for what else could they do? Power had spoken, and power was to be obeyed. For Arsinoe, the triumphal music sounded like a dirge. She knew Ceraunus too well. His ruthlessness, his ambition, his hunger for absolute control. She had played this game long enough to recognize the trap even as she stepped into it. But what choice did she have? Every alternative led to ruin. That night, the mask fell. The true purpose of the marriage revealed itself in an act of cold brutality. Ceraunus's soldiers stormed the chambers, where Arsinoe's younger sons, Lysimachus and Philip, slept. Dragged from their beds, the boys were murdered before dawn, their blood staining the marble floors of the palace. The cries of the queen echoed through Pella's halls, a sound that chilled even the hardened soldiers who carried out the deed. Ceraunus had promised to protect them. Instead, he had destroyed them. To him, they were rivals to be eliminated, obstacles to be crushed beneath his thunderbolt ambition. Arsinoe's grief was immeasurable, but grief was a luxury she could not afford. In that instant, survival became her only weapon. Even as her sons' bodies lay lifeless, she began to plan her escape. She had learned from her father, from her first husband, from years of watching men wield power without mercy. If she wanted to live, and if she wanted her eldest son to one day reclaim his birthright, she would need to outwit the very man who now claimed her as his wife. The poisoned marriage was complete, but Arsinoe was not finished. She had lost 2 sons, a kingdom, and her freedom, yet within her still burned the fire of survival. She would not go quietly into Ceraunus's shadow. She had endured too much, sacrificed too much, to surrender now. And so the queen, who had once been pawned in dynastic games, began to weave her boldest deception, yet a desperate bid for life, vengeance, and the faint hope of redemption. The night after her son's murder, the palace at Pella was thick with incense and silence. But within that silence, a plan stirred. Arsinoe, widow, queen, sister, and now grieving mother, refused to surrender her fate to Ceraunus. She had seen too many courts, too many betrayals, to believe that loyalty or family could save her. Only cunning could, only speed. Whispers travelled in the shadows of the palace, passed from slave to servant, from servant to freedman. Though her world was collapsing, Arsinoe still commanded loyalty, some through devotion, some through the promise of Egyptian gold. With their help, she disguised herself. The jeweled diadem was replaced with a coarse headscarf. The robes of a queen gave way to rough wool, the garb of a servant. In her place, a decoy remained, a woman with similar features, cloaked in shadow, who would delay pursuit for precious hours. The escape was perilous. Soldiers still prowled the palace, their boots echoing on marble floors slick with the blood of her children. Every corner could hold betrayal, every face could be a spy. Yet, under cover of darkness, Arsinoe slipped through secret passages, the same corridors once tread by Alexander's family generations earlier. She did not look back. Outside, the cold night air of Macedonia bit into her skin. She mounted a waiting horse, the animal restless as if sensing the danger. With a small band of loyal retainers, she fled into the wilderness. Behind her, Ceraunus slept, confident that he had broken her. But he had underestimated the woman who had survived Lysimachus's court and Seleucus's invasion. Her destination was Samothrace, a small, windswept island in the northern Aegean. To most, it was a remote outpost. To Arsinoe, it was sanctuary. The island was sacred to the great gods, protectors of sailors and initiates, a place where the mysteries offered safety to all who sought refuge. Even Ceraunus, ruthless as he was, would hesitate to violate its sanctity. The journey itself was a gauntlet. Ceraunus's men scoured the countryside, spreading nets across roads and ports. Arsinoe's group moved through the night, sheltering by day in barns, caves, and the houses of those bold enough to hide them. Sometimes loyalty was bought, sometimes it was freely given by those who pitied the queen's plight. Each encounter was a risk. Betrayal lurked in every smile. Yet she pressed onward, her mind fixed on survival. At last Arsinoe reached the coast. The Aegean stretched before her, dark and restless, its waves flecked with moonlight. The sea was as dangerous as any army storms. Pirates and spies waited on every horizon. Still, she boarded a small vessel, her identity hidden beneath layers of cloth. As the oars cut through the water, she must have wondered whether she was sailing to safety or to her final grave. But fortune, so fickle in her life, granted her one more reprieve. The ship reached Samothrace's rocky shores. The island's temples rose above her like guardians of stone, their ancient columns scarred by centuries of wind and salt. Here, Arsinoe claimed sanctuary. No soldier dared drag her from the sacred precinct of the gods. Yet safety brought no peace. The price of survival had been unbearable. The loss of 2 sons, their young lives extinguished by the man she had called husband. The memory of their cries haunted her, echoing in the temple halls where she prayed. Even in sanctuary, she remained a woman marked by tragedy. But Arsinoe was not finished. She had endured too much to fade into obscurity. Her gaze turned south, across the Mediterranean, to the land of her birth, Egypt. There, her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ruled as pharaoh. If she could return to Alexandria, if she could carve out a place beside him, she might yet turn her shattered life into triumph. Samothrace was not an ending, it was an interlude, a pause in the relentless rhythm of survival. On that island, Arsinoe mourned, but she also planned. She had lost nearly everything, yet she still possessed one thing no betrayal could strip from her: her will to endure. From the windswept temples of Samothrace, Arsinoe gazed southward toward the land of her birth, Egypt. Alexandria, the city her father had helped build, the marble jewel of the Mediterranean. It was both memory and hope. a place where her story might find its next chapter. She was no longer the young princess who had left in a bridal litter at 15. She was a woman hardened by tragedy, scarred by betrayal, and desperate for renewal. Her destination was her brother's court, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, Pharaoh of Egypt, ruler of a thriving kingdom. But in returning to Alexandria, Arsinoe faced a dilemma as dangerous as any battlefield. Would she be welcomed as a sister or watched as a rival? The voyage south was perilous. The Aegean teemed with pirates, many in league with her enemies. Seleucid patrols hunted the seas, and storms battered fragile vessels. To conceal herself, Arsinoe travelled in disguise, sometimes a pilgrim in rough linen, sometimes a merchant's wife with her face shadowed by a veil. Her beauty, once her greatest political tool, was now a liability that had to be hidden. Each port she passed through whispered with rumours: the queen who fled, the widow whose sons had been slain, the woman who carried both tragedy and danger in her wake. At last Alexandria rose before her. Its great lighthouse, the Pharos, loomed above the sea, guiding ships safely into the harbour. Yet for Arsinoe, that beacon was no simple light of salvation, it was a test. Behind those walls awaited her brother, a ruler she barely knew, a man who had been a child when she first left Egypt. Would he see her as blood, or as threat? The reunion was staged in the palace at Alexandria, a place of glittering mosaics and marble colonnades. Ptolemy II was a man of letters, cautious and deliberate, more scholar than soldier. Egypt prospered under his rule, its temples restored, its trade routes rich, its scholars gathered in the great library. But prosperity breeds suspicion. To welcome Arsinoe was to risk division. To reject her was to risk scandal. When brother and sister met, the air must have been thick with tension. Arsinoe was no longer the pliant girl their father had married off. She stood before him as a survivor, a queen twice over, with the authority of experience etched into every line of her face. For Ptolemy, she was both opportunity and danger. She could be an ally seasoned in diplomacy, hardened by survival or a rival, one whose presence could overshadow his careful rule. The negotiations between them were delicate. Arsinoe needed sanctuary, but not merely survival. She had not endured exile, betrayal, and grief to fade into comfortable obscurity. She wanted power. She wanted a role worthy of her name. She would not accept being a forgotten sister, tucked away in a palace corner. She had worn crowns before, and she meant to wear one again. Ptolemy, too, had ambitions. He was pharaoh, but he lacked the charisma of his father, Ptolemy I. His reign was stable, prosperous, but unremarkable. By aligning himself with Arsinoe, he could strengthen his dynasty's claim, draw on her political acumen, and link his rule to the divine traditions of Egypt itself. For 3,000 years, the pharaohs had sometimes married their sisters, echoing the sacred union of Isis and Osiris. To the Greeks, such unions were abhorrent, a violation of natural order, but to the Egyptians, they were sacred, an affirmation of cosmic harmony. Thus emerged a daring and scandalous solution: marriage. Ptolemy would divorce his current wife and wed his sister. The proposal shocked the Greek world. Philosophers debated whether it was decadence or divine precedent. Poets sneered, while priests in Egypt nodded with approval. What seemed perverse to Athens was sacred to Memphis. The wedding was staged with deliberate grandeur. In Memphis, the ancient city of the pharaohs, beneath the columns of the great temple of Ptah, the union was sanctified. Arsinoe wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the symbol of pharaonic sovereignty. Ptolemy held the crook and flail, the regalia of a shepherd king. Priests chanted hymns older than the pyramids, invoking Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings who ruled the underworld. In that moment, Arsinoe was transformed. No longer the widow of Thrace, no longer the pawn of Macedonia, she was queen once more. She became Arsinoe Philadelphus, the sibling-loving goddess. Together, she and her brother declared themselves not merely rulers, but divine. The Greeks of Alexandria were scandalized, the Egyptians enthralled, and the world took notice. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now a revolution in power. Arsinoe had turned exile into triumph, disgrace into divinity. But with this transformation came a new burden: to make their union more than spectacle, to make it the foundation of an empire. The sister who had been sold as a pawn had returned home as a goddess. And now, in the palace of Alexandria, her influence was about to reshape Egypt and the Hellenistic world. When Arsinoe II emerged as Queen of Egypt beside her brother-husband Ptolemy II, the transformation was nothing short of astonishing. For decades, She had been passed like a coin through the hands of kings and generals. Now, at last, she held power in her own right. Not hidden behind a husband, not merely mother to heirs, but seated openly as co-ruler of Egypt. The Greeks sneered. They called the marriage decadent, whispered that it was incest, cloaked in ritual. Philosophers in Athens raised eyebrows, muttering about moral decay. But for the Egyptians, who had long worshipped Isis and Osiris as divine siblings whose marriage sustained the cosmos, it was nothing less than sacred. The Ptolemies were no longer foreigners in their eyes, they were pharaohs in the ancient sense, rulers ordained by the gods, gods themselves in human form. This was no accident. Arsinoe understood the power of symbols. Her marriage to Ptolemy II was not just political, it was myth made flesh. Every coin minted with their faces, every temple relief that depicted them as divine consorts, proclaimed to the world that Egypt's rulers were beyond mortal law. Their bond was not scandal but destiny. But Arsinoe did not rest on spectacle alone. She immersed herself in governance with a zeal that surprised many. She accompanied Ptolemy on royal tours along the Nile, listening to disputes among farmers, priests, and merchants. She took her place in the royal council, where her sharp mind and hard-won experience made her voice impossible to ignore. Diplomats and generals alike came to realize that Egypt now had not one ruler, but two. She was more than figurehead, she was strategist. The world beyond Egypt was shifting like sand in a storm. To the north, the Seleucid Empire reeled from succession struggles. To the west, Rome was beginning its rise, though still a distant power. In Greece, old city-states clung to faded glory while new leagues tested their strength. The Mediterranean was a chessboard of alliances, betrayals, and wars, and Arsinoe played the game with mastery. It was she who urged Ptolemy to act decisively in the First Syrian War against Antiochus I. Where her brother hesitated, preferring stability over risk, Arsinoe pressed for action. Strike while his empire bleeds, she may have argued, drawing on her bitter memory of Lysimachus hesitating before crushing rivals. Under her counsel, Egyptian armies advanced into Coeli, Syria and Palestine, reclaiming lost ground and reminding the world of Egypt's power. Victory brought prestige, but Arsinoe's genius was in how she shaped its memory. Poets were commissioned to celebrate her as a warrior queen, a new Helen who brought triumph rather than ruin. Coins depicted her crowned with the horns of Ammon, the Egyptian god of kingship, placing her in the company of Alexander the Great himself. Sculptors carved her likeness alongside Ptolemy's in temples from Alexandria to Thebes, eternalizing their divine union. But she did not confine her vision to war and ritual. Arsinoe saw the future of Egypt in its culture and learning. The Library of Alexandria grew under her patronage, drawing scholars, poets, and philosophers from across the world. Theocritus, the great poet of pastoral verse, composed works praising her as a goddess among mortals, a patroness of the arts as well as of power. She gave stipends to thinkers, hosted debates, and transformed Alexandria into the beating intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. Her influence reached into religion as well. For the first time, a living queen was given her own cult. Temples rose in her name, festivals celebrated her divinity. Priests conducted rites to honor her as a goddess alongside Isis. It was unprecedented, not after death, but in life. Arsinoe was worshipped. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also something more. She had endured the worst cruelties power could inflict. Now, she stood not as pawn but as deity, shaping how future generations would understand queenship itself. Yet beneath the grandeur, the scars of her past remained. She had lost 2 sons to her half-brother's ambition. She had fled through the night, disguised and hunted. Those memories never left her. They sharpened her resolve, made her relentless in consolidating Egypt's power. She would ensure no one could ever again treat her as expendable. And in doing so, she carved a place not just for herself, but for every Ptolemaic queen who would follow. In the great halls of Alexandria, her presence was everywhere. Courtiers lowered their eyes when she entered. Ambassadors measured their words before her. Priests bowed, poets flattered, generals listened. She was no longer just the sister wife of the pharaoh. She was Arsinoe Philadelphus, the goddess, the strategist, the survivor who had remade herself into one of the most powerful women of the ancient world. But power is never secure. For every victory won, new dangers loomed beyond the horizon. And Arsinoe, more than anyone, knew that fortune was fickle, that the gods who raise mortals to divinity can just as swiftly cast them down. By the mid-272 BCE, Arsinoe II was no longer simply queen or consort. She had become something unique in the Hellenistic world, the architect of a dynasty's future. Her influence extended beyond the throne, into the very structure of how power would be inherited, legitimized, and remembered. The Ptolemaic dynasty had begun less than half a century earlier, when Ptolemy I Soter carved Egypt from the ruins of Alexander's empire. But the dynasty still felt fragile. Foreign rulers wearing Egyptian crowns, Macedonians speaking Greek in palaces that overlooked the Nile. It was Arsinoe who gave the Ptolemies what they most desperately needed: permanence. She understood the power of tradition. By modeling her marriage to Ptolemy II after the union of Isis and Osiris, she forged a bridge between the Greek newcomers and the sacred continuity of Egypt's past. When Egyptians saw her standing beside her brother husband, crowned in regalia that echoed the gods, they no longer saw strangers. They saw pharaoh and great royal wife, embodiments of divine order. But Arsinoe's genius lay not only in religious symbolism, it was in dynasty building. She was acutely aware that dynasties are not sustained merely by armies or riches, but by stories and structures that endure. Under her direction, royal propaganda shifted into overdrive. Coins bore her image alongside her husband's, a visual proclamation that she was not an accessory but a co-ruler. Inscriptions referred to them as the sibling-loving gods, a title that would echo through centuries. She also turned her sharp political instincts toward the succession. Ptolemy II had children from his first wife, but Arsinoe ensured they were bound to her, not set against her. She treated the crown prince with honor, guiding him with counsel that reflected her own hard-earned lessons. She may have lost her own sons, but she would not allow Egypt's future rulers to forget who had secured their throne. In this way, Arsinoe acted less as mother of heirs and more as mother of the dynasty itself. Her influence on foreign affairs was equally decisive. When Antiochus I of the Seleucid Empire threatened Egypt's holdings, Arsinoe's counsel pushed for aggression rather than passivity. Her presence on campaign, though symbolic, carried immense weight. Soldiers saw in her a leader who did not flinch from war's realities. Victory was credited to both king and queen, reinforcing the divine pairing as not just ritual, but force of empire. And yet, Arsinoe's reach extended beyond politics and war into culture itself. She poured resources into the library and museum of Alexandria, ensuring that Egypt's capital became the intellectual beacon of the Mediterranean. Poets like Callimachus and Theocritus composed hymns to her divinity, while scholars catalogued knowledge from every corner of the known world. This was not vanity, it was strategy. By placing Alexandria at the center of thought, she ensured that Egypt was not merely powerful, but indispensable. Perhaps her boldest move was commissioning her own cult while still alive. Shrines were dedicated to her worship, priests appointed in her name, festivals instituted in her honor. For the first time in Greek memory, a queen was elevated to divine status during her lifetime. It shocked many, but it also worked. Egyptians had long accepted the pharaoh as a god. Now they accepted his queen as goddess. Together, the divine siblings ruled not just Egypt, but imagination itself. The model Arsinoe built would outlast her by centuries. Future queens, from Cleopatra II to Cleopatra VII, would inherit the template she forged: sibling marriage, shared rule, divine cult. Her life had been marked by exile, betrayal, and the deaths of her sons, but her legacy was to reshape queenship into an institution of power. No longer mere pawns of dynastic marriages, Ptolemaic queens would stand as rulers in their own right, gods in human form. But such greatness came at a cost. For all her triumphs, Arsinoe was not immortal. The same relentless will that had carried her through exile and betrayal could not shield her from the frailties of the body. By her mid-40s, the toll of her life began to show. Illness, perhaps worsened by years of stress and grief, weakened her. The woman who had once defied kings and generals now faced an enemy she could not outwit. Still, even in her decline, she shaped her legacy. Priests whispered of her as already divine. Poets wrote of her as eternal. And Ptolemy II, who owed so much of his stability to her, ensured her image would endure beyond her last breath. Arsinoe had risen from pawn to goddess. She had redefined queenship, reshaped dynastic power, and bound her name to eternity. But history, as ever, demanded its price, and her story was approaching its final chapter. By 270 BCE, Arsinoe II stood at the height of her power and on the edge of her mortality. She was only in her mid-40s, but the weight of her life had been immense. Wars, betrayals, exiles, and endless intrigues had carved themselves into her body and mind. Her beauty, once the subject of poets, had hardened into something more formidable, the aura of a survivor, a woman who had endured where others perished. Yet, even as her body faltered, her image only grew stronger. In Alexandria, she was adored as a living goddess. Statues portrayed her crowned with the double diadem of Egypt, flanked by symbols of Isis and Aphrodite. Coins bore her likeness, distributed across the Mediterranean, ensuring that even in distant marketplaces, people saw her as divine. Her cult was unlike anything seen before. Temples were erected in her honor, not after her death but while she still walked the palace halls. Priests sang hymns to her as the embodiment of divine love and cosmic order. Festivals bore her name, and offerings were made as if she were already among the immortals. This was not merely propaganda, it was belief. To Egyptians, the pharaoh and his queen had become gods. To the Greeks, scandal gave way to awe. Behind the scenes, Arsinoe continued to wield power. Her counsel still guided Ptolemy II, her influence still shaped Egypt's foreign policy, and her patronage still enriched Alexandria's intellectual life. But she must have known her time was short. Illness, or perhaps poison, as some whispered, slowly drained her strength. The end came quietly, without the thunder of battle or the drama of betrayal. In 270 BCE, Arsinoe II died, leaving behind no living children, but a dynasty transformed. She had outlived husbands, half-brothers, and rivals. She had survived the slaughter of her sons and the collapse of kingdoms. She had risen, against all odds, to a place no other woman of her age had reached, worshipped as a goddess in her lifetime, remembered as the mother of Ptolemaic power. Her funeral was an event of staggering magnificence. The procession wound through Alexandria for days. Priests in white linen carried her image beside that of Ptolemy, chanting prayers that blended Greek hymns with Egyptian invocations. Citizens lined the streets to mourn, some as subjects, others as worshippers. Poets recited verses praising her as a new Isis, a queen who had sacrificed everything to preserve the dynasty. Ptolemy II ensured her deification was absolute. He established her eternal cult as Arsinoe Philadelphus, the sibling-loving goddess. Her temples continued to burn incense in her honor for centuries. Her image adorned shrines, coins, and monuments across Egypt and beyond. In life, she had fought to survive. In death, she was enshrined as eternal. The irony was sharp and cruel. Arsinoe had lost her sons, yet her legacy endured not through blood but through institutions. Every Ptolemaic sibling marriage that followed, every queen who ruled as goddess, every coin struck with paired rulers, these were her children, her creations, her immortality. She had been forced into incest twice, betrayed by men she trusted, hunted through the night, and stripped of her motherhood. Yet she had transformed these humiliations into weapons. The pawn had become a queen, the queen a goddess, the goddess, a symbol that reshaped an empire. As her body was laid to rest, Egypt whispered prayers not to a woman, but to a deity. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Arsinoe smiled a smile not of triumph but of vindication. She had been broken, but she had remade herself. She had been silenced, but she had carved her name into eternity. Her story was not just of power gained and lost. It was of transformation, the most dangerous, most costly, but also the most enduring kind. Arsinoe II's death did not end her influence. In many ways, it was only the beginning. What she left behind was not simply memory but an institution, an idea that outlived her flesh and blood. Ptolemy II, devastated by the loss of his partner, ensured her image would never fade. Her deification was not symbolic, it was systematic. Across Egypt, temples were instructed to honor her alongside the gods. Priests were appointed to maintain her cult. Coins continued to carry her face, paired with his, cementing her as eternal consort and divine queen. This innovation, deifying a queen during and after her lifetime, became a cornerstone of Ptolemaic power. Later queens like Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, and the legendary Cleopatra VII would trace their authority directly back to Arsinoe's precedent. They wore her titles, invoked her divine aura, and leaned on the same fusion of Egyptian and Greek traditions that she had pioneered. Without her, Cleopatra VII might never have had the confidence or legitimacy to stand before Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony as their equal. Arsinoe's shadow stretched across centuries, but the brilliance of her achievement carried a tragic undertone. Every sibling marriage that followed in the Ptolemaic line, sometimes strengthening dynastic control, sometimes plunging the dynasty into civil war, was a reflection of her gamble. The institution she forged out of desperation and brilliance became both the dynasty's greatest weapon and its greatest curse. Some future queens flourished under the model she created. Others were destroyed by it. The Hellenistic world, too, did not forget her. Poets praised her as a goddess, while satirists whispered of her ambition and ruthlessness. To her enemies, she was Medea reborn, a woman who would sacrifice even her own children to secure power. To her admirers, she was a visionary who had transformed victimhood into sovereignty, who had carved a place for women in a world ruled by men. Both images held truth, and together they made her unforgettable. Even the Romans, centuries later, were fascinated. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and beheld Cleopatra VII, he marveled at her confidence, her command, her divine bearing. His advisors told him that she carried herself as Arsinoe II, once had as if born not merely to rule but to be worshipped. The Roman conquest would erase the Ptolemies, but not Arsinoe's template for power. Her vision outlasted her dynasty, etched into the memory of history. And yet, behind the grandeur, her story remains painfully human. She was a girl sold into marriage at 15, a mother who watched 2 sons slaughtered, a refugee who fled in disguise, a sister forced into incest, and finally, a woman who turned every humiliation into a stepping stone toward power. She paid with her bloodline, her peace, and her humanity. What remained was myth. The legacy of Arsinoe II is thus a paradox. She is remembered both as victim and victor, as pawn and queen, as mother and goddess. She reshaped her dynasty, but at a cost so profound that even in her triumph, she seems tragic. She did not save her children, but she saved the Ptolemaic throne. She did not preserve her humanity, but she achieved immortality. Standing in the ruins of the Alexandrian palaces today, one can almost hear her echo the soft whisper of a woman who refused to be broken, whose story is stitched into every coin, every monument, every queen who came after her. Arsinoe II, the pawn who became a goddess, remains one of history's most haunting figures. Her sun set long ago, yet its afterglow lingers, proof that even in a world built to silence women, one voice could echo across millennia. History has a way of compressing lives into symbols. Arsinoe II, in the centuries after her death, became less a person and more a legend, a prism through which others refracted their hopes, fears, and warnings. To the Ptolemaic dynasty, she was the sacred origin of sibling marriage, the divine sister-wife who legitimized their rule. To moralists and later Roman writers, she was a cautionary tale, proof of how ambition twisted natural bonds and corrupted even the purest of human ties. Her cult endured long after her death. In Alexandria, festivals in her honor drew crowds who offered incense and prayers as if she were Isis herself. Across Egypt, her name appeared in hymns, stelae, and temple walls. Coins bearing her portrait circulated from the Nile Delta to the shores of Cyprus, her features frozen in idealized beauty, ageless, divine, untouchable. She had become more than queen, she was an institution, a goddess who would forever sanctify Ptolemaic rule. But institutions have consequences. The sibling marriage she pioneered was not just a symbol of divine legitimacy, it became a political necessity. Every future Ptolemaic king and queen would be measured against the precedent she set. Cleopatra II married her brother, then her other brother, then her own daughter married her uncle. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of all, married 2 brothers in turn, their unions less about love than survival. Each of these marriages traced its roots to Arsinoe's bold, desperate decision. What she had begun as a lifeline became a dynasty's hallmark, a tradition both stabilizing and suffocating. Outside Egypt, the judgment was harsh. Greek chroniclers condemned her as a corrupter of natural order. Roman historians portrayed her as a symbol of decadence, a prelude to the excesses that would justify Rome's eventual conquest. They did not see her courage, her endurance, or her cunning. They saw only scandal. And yet, even their condemnations ensured her survival in memory. A woman erased by silence is forgotten. A woman cursed in ink is remembered. There is a darker irony too. Arsinoe sacrificed everything, her youth, her children, her peace to secure the dynasty's survival. But in doing so, she created a tradition that trapped her successors in the same web of incest, suspicion, and betrayal that had haunted her. The curse of Arsinoe II was not supernatural but structural. She saved her dynasty, but she also doomed it to repeat her sacrifices. Every Ptolemaic queen who endured intrigue, every child murdered in the palace halls, every poisoned cup at a royal feast, all echoed the choices she had made. And yet, perhaps that is why she still captivates us. Arsinoe II embodies the contradictions of power. She was victim and victor, sacrificial pawn and ruthless player, tragic mother and eternal goddess. She forces us to ask unsettling questions. How much must one give up to survive? What is the cost of power, when measured not in wealth or land, but in human lives? Can triumph ever truly wash away the blood that bought it? In the end, her story resists easy answers. That is her legacy. She does not fit neatly into the categories of villain or heroine. She endures as something far more haunting, a reminder that power, once seized, always demands its price, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to surrender one's humanity to become a myth. Arsinoe II did just that, and for that reason, her shadow still lingers, long after the dynasty she fought to preserve crumbled into dust. Centuries have passed since Arsinoe II walked the marble corridors of Alexandria and the blood-stained halls of Pella. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself is long gone, swept away by the tides of Rome. Cleopatra VII, its final jewel, took her life rather than parade through Roman streets in chains, and with her, the house of Ptolemy collapsed into history. Yet Arsinoe's story still whispers across time, sometimes as scandal, sometimes as prophecy, always as enigma. To the Greeks, she was remembered with unease, a queen who blurred the lines between marriage and sacrilege, between diplomacy and betrayal. To the Romans, she was folded into their cautionary tales of Eastern decadence, a convenient villain to explain why empires fell. But to Egypt, she remained something far greater. Her deified image was worshipped for generations. Her name was invoked in prayers for fertility, prosperity, and protection. For Egyptians, she was not merely a queen, she was a goddess, part of the eternal cycle of life and death along the Nile. Even modern historians cannot fully pin her down. Some see her as ruthless, a Medea who sacrificed her stepson and endangered her children in her climb to power. Others see her as a survivor, a woman navigating a world where women were pawns, turning her pawnship into a crown. Still others view her as a visionary, someone who understood that identity itself, Greek and Egyptian, mortal and divine, woman and goddess, could be wielded as a weapon. Her life reminds us of the brutal truth behind dynasties. Power is rarely inherited without blood, rarely kept without sacrifice. The Ptolemies became infamous for their incestuous unions, their rivalries, their blood-soaked palace intrigues. But at the root of that legacy stands Arsinoe II, the sister wife, the goddess queen, the survivor who turned personal tragedy into dynastic destiny. And yet, beneath the myths, she was still human. A girl forced into marriage at 15, a mother who lost 2 sons to her half-brother's blade, a woman who fled for her life in the dead of night, disguised as a servant. Those human details cut through the marble mask, reminding us that even the most mythologized figures bled, wept, and feared. That is the paradox of Arsinoe II. She is both the most remembered and the most misunderstood of queens. Her divinity was proclaimed, but her humanity was erased. Perhaps that was the price she chose to pay. To survive in a world that devoured women, she let herself become more than woman. She became goddess, myth, legend. Today, standing in the ruins of Alexandria, or looking upon the faded inscriptions that still bear her name, we are left with echoes, not just of a queen who ruled, but of a woman who endured, who fought, who transformed survival into supremacy. Her life asks us questions that remain as sharp now as they were then. What will you sacrifice for power? What will you endure for survival? And when the world demands that you become more than human, will you resist, or will you let yourself be remade into myth? Arsinoe II chose the latter, and for that reason, though her body lies in dust, her story still burns like a flame that refuses to die. A reminder that history's greatest figures are never just rulers or victims, but something in between. They are myths,